So let's revisit the impacts on ocean ecosystems. We talked about acidification and impacts on shell-forming animals like corals. Remember, these are just introductions to the topic. This is supposed to be a basic course. So in each direction, you have to follow up into details if you're interested. So I'm just giving you a broad view of the physical, biological, chemical oceanography and climate change impacts and feedbacks, right? So looking again at physical, biological, and socio-economics, which cannot be ignored in the Earth system because we are part of the problem now, and the question is, will we be part of the solution as well, right? So if you look at the ocean atmosphere changes, we have change in bodies. So if you look at the organisms, you can have changes in body size, reproduction, primary productivity, and habitats. There are certain species whose sexual selection, for example, depends on temperature. There are lizards in Thailand which are beginning to become all female because of warming, for example. So these are the kind of effects you can have. Population dynamics changes because, as we said, at a given place over time, a ecosystem would have evolved. So lizards would have evolved to depend on certain insects. The insects would depend on some larvae and whatever else, and so on. There is a food chain, right? When change happens, some species can move. They're called generalists, mobile generalists, whereas some are sedentary specialists. They evolve to exploit the situation that exists there and they cannot move. So you can change population structure and dynamics, community ecosystems as well. And then you have fisheries ecosystems that we are putting pressure on some part of the food web, as we said, fishing down the food web or taking out certain predators and perturbing the food chain and the food web and so on. And then there is global issues. So when I sit here in Mumbai and I'm eating fish, sometimes the fish could be coming from the Pacific or the Atlantic. If I'm paying good money for a salmon, it could come from Norway, for example. Or I could get a Chilean sea bass, which is the ugly toothfish, you remember? Okay, so changes in population growth, abundance, and species regulation, species distribution, community structure, and so on. So the cascade of effect through the system is not always easy to predict, let alone even not easy to track, let alone try to predict, because we don't always know how the interdependencies work, especially in the wild, in the open, because we don't have enough data, we don't have enough monitoring systems. I will show what are some of the new monitoring systems that are being developed. Nonetheless, there are efforts like this, terrestrial protected areas and marine and coastal protected areas. I won't say much other than to say that the marine protected area is very tiny compared to the vast oceans and the massive industrial fishing that happens. Billions of dollars of fish are caught each year, but the protected areas are tiny. Some attempts are made to identify susceptible areas, key species or keystone species or indicator species and so on, to see if we protect them, can you protect the whole chain? It turns out, as I mentioned in another podcast, marine protected areas do tend to radiate the good impacts outside the protected area. The fish keep getting exchanged often, and fishing productivity around the protected area does go up. But one president can come and define or declare a protected area. The next president might come and say that's not protected anymore. So we are always doing this one step forward, two step back dance on these issues. On land, the impacts are much more obvious because we have better monitoring, better documentation from the past. For example, distribution of the monarch butterflies or certain types of plants or mosquito populations, birds migrating at different times of the year or different latitudes. All kinds of documentations exist, but there are also changes like this where this is the number of growing days in a year, the crops or vegetation can have what are called growing days, because that depends on when the sunlight and the temperature become suitable for photosynthesis following the fall-winter months, right? So if you look at the long-term average, somewhat like the temperature, the number of growing days was less than the long-term average, began to jump around just the time that the temperatures were changing. Then there was a drop, and now in the recent warming period, spring arrives early, which means the winter temperatures are already not warm enough, but the spring-like temperatures arrive much earlier, by as many as 2 weeks or longer. This can have all kinds of unintended consequences as well. For example, the wild cherries in Michigan, they are beginning to bloom earlier, thinking the winter is over, but then the winter is actually not over, and then you get a blast of cold Arctic air and they get decimated, and then when the real spring comes, they have already been harmed. Right? So this is not going to be easy to adapt to for many species. So climate change is generally thought of as a triple threat for the ocean in terms of warmer temperatures, warmer waters, more acidic waters that we already talked about. What we haven't talked about much is less oxygen. So there is a process called deoxygenation, which is related to multiple things. Warming reduces the solubility of oxygen, especially in the surface waters. That's not good news. And there are changes in production which can actually also cause eutrophication, deoxygenation, anoxia, hypoxia. So there's plenty of evidence that actually anoxic regions are expanding, especially in the coastal regions, because of increased agricultural activity, nutrient runoffs, human habitation, petroleum and other kind of environmental pollution, and so on and so forth. Okay, so ocean again takes up more than 90% of the heat and about quarter of the CO2 emissions. Sea level rise is a threat. Coral bleaching is already happening, and the sad news is that huge parts of the Great Barrier Reef may not be recovering. Remember, bleaching used to be a natural process, because when El Nino happens, you do get coral bleaching. That is natural, but they have evolved to recover from that kind of bleaching. So if you have El Nino and then there is a warming on top, then they don't recover. It's like being old and getting flu. If you're a middle-aged person, you might get flu and recover, but if you're old and you get flu, you might get into pneumonia and other things and then gone, right? So habitat destructions, habitat modifications, acidifications, fishing pressures, and so on. So this is a slightly broader view of the climate change impacts on the ocean, but this topic is incredibly broad, so you have to follow each thing, especially if you're interested in a particular region, particular coast, or particular part of the open ocean. Then you have to understand the dynamics of that part, the local heating, the local circulation, the local anthropogenic CO2 penetration, local acidification, etc., etc. So complicated, but depends on your passion and your perseverance and your ability to follow through.